Then someone said to Jesus, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the family inheritance with me." And Jesus said to him, "Friend, who appointed me as arbitrator or judge between you and your brother?" And then he said to them, "Watch out. Guard yourself against all kinds of greed. After all, one's life isn't determined by one's possessions, even when someone is very wealthy." Then he told them a parable. The land of a certain rich man produced a bountiful crop. And he said to himself, "Well, what should I do? I have no place to store my harvest." Then he thought, "Here's what I'll do. I'll tear down my barns and build bigger ones. And that's where I'll store all my grain and goods. And then I will say to myself, 'Self, you have stored up ample goods, enough for many years. Take it easy. Eat, drink, enjoy yourself.' But God said to that man, 'Fool, tonight you will die, and all these things that you have stored up, whose will they be?' This is the way it will be with those who hoard things for themselves, but aren't rich toward God." The story of the rich fool from Luke 12 is a lot of fun to tell because of the kind of exaggeration and comedy that's involved. And it's actually a fairly easy story to learn because it's so familiar to many people who have heard these gospel stories before. And so it's actually a really nice story to tell to new story learners in a workshop. So it is fun, it is well known, in some ways it's easy to learn in those ways. And yet there is a kind of subtlety to the story that rewards further study and rewards the kind of reflection that you have to do as a storyteller. One of the places I think where that subtlety comes in is when you have to decide what tone of voice to use for Jesus and then especially God at the end. And I think I'm still struggling in some ways with how Jesus should sound when he is questioned by this person who comes to him and says, "Teacher, right, make this decision between myself and my brother." And how does Jesus respond? Is it out of frustration? Is it kind of out of compassion? I opted for a more compassionate response where he kind of maybe chuckles, "Friend, who set me up as the arbitrator between you and your brother?" Right? So that kind of a more compassionate, more easing into that response. But I don't think that's the only way that Jesus can respond. And certainly the next words that he says, "Watch out," have a little bit more intensity to them, a little bit more aggression possibly. And so it might be appropriate to have a little bit stronger response. But I think that's one of the areas where, as a storyteller, you are going to have to struggle with this story and experiment and try some different things and figure out what is natural in your voice and your body and what makes the most sense for you. The other place where this comes into play, I think in particular, is at the end when God appears in the story. And so you have at the very end that language where God says, "Fool, don't you know that this very day you will die?" And I think that could be said in a number of different ways. I think it certainly could be said as in a tone of condemnation, where it comes across that God is, the pronouncement that he is a fool is kind of a punishment for what he has done. The punishment for him hoarding rather than sharing. And so God can come and say, "Fool, tonight you will die," right? His death is a kind of punishment for the way that he's chosen to live. That's not the way that the story makes the most sense to me. That's not the way I chose to tell it rather. Instead, for me, I imagine a kind of sadness in God's tone. His death is just chance. It's not a punishment from God. It's just that tonight is the night that he is going to die. And so God is in a kind of sadness is saying, you fool, you have spent all this time trying to store up for a future that you're not going to have. You should have known better. Maybe you should have read Ecclesiastes, which talks a lot about the vanity of trying to hold on to and store up things. And instead, there's a kind of foolishness that this person exhibits, and God, maybe out of sadness, responds to him. So there are some choices you need to make here in terms of the tone of voice, and those are the choices I made that made sense for me. And other storytellers might make some different choices, and therefore seeing some multiple tellings of the story could open up some possibilities and help us understand it better. Another very clear choice that I made was in my gestures to use over and over again this gesture of kind of storing up things, right? And holding things in my hands to kind of symbolize the weight and the amount of things that this man is trying to store up. And I even changed some language, and rather than saying all the things that I had prepared, all the things that you have prepared, I changed it to all the things that you have stored up. Again, to make that verbal link and to make that verbal link even more obvious through the gestures. And for me, this gesture helps to tie together different parts of the story, where we have the man storing up, and we have God's pronouncement against him for storing up, and we even have Jesus' summation at the end that this is the way it will be with those who hoard. And so I could use that same gesture and tie together those different parts of the story. However, for me, the real payoff comes not in this story alone, but actually in hearing other stories from Luke's gospel along with this story. And I think you could choose a number of stories, but for me, the ones that come to mind are the stories of the rich ruler and Zacchaeus at the end of chapter 18 and the beginning of chapter 19 of Luke's gospel. And I think if you were telling a series of stories from Luke, or telling the whole gospel of Luke, then establishing a gesture here for the rich fool who holds on to and stores up and cannot let go, then that allows you to make a link maybe with the rich ruler who is also unable to let go when he is invited by Jesus to do so in chapter 18. He can't do it, but Zacchaeus does. And so when Zacchaeus tells Jesus in Luke 19, "Here and now I give half of my possessions to the poor, and if I have wronged anyone, I'll pay back 4 times the amount." If you kind of have this gesture that you can use for folks who that option they have to hold on to and to cling to things in order to provide for their own security, or to let go, then you can provide this kind of contrast. And of course, then Jesus says to Zacchaeus, "Today salvation has come to this house." Right? That letting go of possessions as the thing that will provide security, and relying instead on the God who gives good gifts is where one will find salvation. And so I think this gesture that I'm using here in this story in Luke 12 has even a bigger payoff if I keep it in mind and use it again in some other stories from Luke's gospel.